Welcome, everyone. I'm Jeff Carpenter, and I'm hosting this panel discussion from our art exhibition, FEMA, Fear Environmental Management Atrocities, which came about when we saw that the data on flooding is now so available that you can look up and see when your house is going to flood and how badly. And it's all across the country that this is going to threaten our lives in the next decade or two. And because of that, I thought up with Diane the idea for this panel discussion. When artists confront the dilemma of climate change awareness or the lack of, there's a very difficult challenge how to craft your message because we're up against such a hidden adversary. In 1982, the American Petroleum Institute had a poll that showed 80% of Americans believed that climate change was an issue and that the government should do something about it. And they, along with Charles Koch and his network of about 30 ultra-wealthy individuals, put together a campaign. They hired political strategists and experts in psychological warfare, and they came up with phony grassroots organizations, 5,000 professorships in universities across the country who were teaching that regulating energy is bad and that climate science is unproven. And in the wake of this, we thought we needed to do something big to answer back. So we put together this exhibition, Flooded with Water, because we wanted to ask, not if you want to save humanity, but if you want to save your own home or that of your friends. And the moderator for this panel discussion is Diane Burko, an artist, an explorer, an activist whose projects have taken her to the Arctic, to Antarctica, to the Great Barrier Reef, wherever there are extreme environmental conditions that show the catastrophe that's unfolding in slow motion. She's recently had exhibition at the National Academy of Sciences in Washington, DC, at the highly respected Locke's Gallery in Philadelphia, at the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts, and the Michener Museum of Art. She's a Renaissance woman, and I'm honored to introduce Diane Burko.
Well, thank you, Jeff, and thank you for that introduction. I wasn't expecting it. I found out about Jeff just by a friend who's in the show, Marsha Emberg, who sent me an email. I said, wow, I don't know nothing about this. And then when I saw what it was about, I said, this guy is really doing something important. This is an incredible exhibition, and the idea of filling an art gallery with water. I mean, you're bringing it home, Jeffrey, and thank you for doing that. When I thought about flooding, two people come to mind who are friends of mine. And they're right with us here, Eve Mosher and Stacy Levy. So I'm going to do one little quick share to show you some stuff, and then I'm going to turn over this whole thing to these very important women who really have done groundbreaking work in flooding, and all those issues. So bear with me while I share my screen and see if this works. Sometimes it does, and sometimes it doesn't. I think it actually is working. There it is. Okay. So what I wanted to say is that although water has always been a part of my practice, basically water where it's melting, polar ice, sea level rise, which then contributes, of course, to flooding, and to paintings that I make, and warm water, Pacific Ocean water, where, of course, we have to worry about all the living ecosystems that are being destroyed, and I make paintings about that. But I want to quickly turn to when Eve Mosher and Stacy Levy actually were showing together in a show that I was also in. You remember this, ladies, way back?
Yeah.
In 2013. I already was friends with Stacy from way back through many, many different connections, but this was the first time I met Eve, although I first read about Eve in the New Yorker, Lucky Eve. I remember that article that mentioned of Elizabeth Colbert talking about your high water line. And that's when I first became aware of you, but I know you through Amy Lipton and other ECHO people. And I just realized you two are the ones that really have to talk about this issue. Your work is so important. And also what you do, I think better than I do actually, is you engage with the community and the public in your various practices. And so I'm going to turn it over to you guys. Did we decide who's going first?
Have Eve go first.
Eve, you're going first. Okay, so I'm going to oh, wait, that's the last slide. I forgot about that. There you can see Stacy's. Stacy, you couldn't make that opening. I remember you were flying somewhere else, doing something else. But I should also mention, actually, there's a show that both Stacy and I are in at the Michener Museum, which is a local museum in this area, called Rising Tides. And Stacy has an incredible installation there. So if you guys can get there, I think it's going till January, Stacy?
I think till January, mid-January.
So that's another opportunity. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing. And there you go, Eve, it's all yours.
Great. Thank you, Diane, and thank you, Jeff. And as always, great to be here with you as well, Stacy. I myself am now going to share. We're going to keep passing around the sharing screens and talk a little bit about my work as it relates to water and climate change and just where I come from and where I am at with my work. So I actually grew up, if I can get this to advance, there we go. I grew up in west of Houston, Texas, where a lot of the landscape is defined by water retention, water management infrastructure. But growing up, it was not something that was common knowledge. I actually grew up very close to the beginning of the Buffalo Bayou, but I never knew that. I grew up in the area that was traditionally rice paddy area, which is, somewhere that's going to be wet a lot of the time, but we didn't know about that. And while it did flood pretty seriously every year, it was just taken as part of, living in the environment, as opposed to understanding that maybe some of the development there was not being done with respect for the natural environment. So this is one of the major dams. This is Barker Cypress, and we saw this as a great recreation area. There's sports fields near this. It's good for cardboard sledding in the summer, but it's also the thing that was released and did not hold back the water when Harvey hit. So I think Harvey really brought to light the reality of Houston as a place that should be doing a better job of living with the water. And this happened well into my own sort of career of looking at climate change, but it did make me realize that I come from a place where water was very much a part of our everyday life, whether we knew the kind of systems at play or not. And I think that's fed a lot into the work that I'm doing. I now live in New York City. We are an archipelago, which means we're a peninsula and a bunch of islands. And we have 520 miles of coastline. And when I first started looking at climate impacts in 2006, I realized that New York City was vulnerable in similar but different ways as Houston, and that it was really a city that needed to be living with the water and understanding its relationship to the water. And for the most part, we don't recognize our relationship to the water. And I have done some work in Philadelphia, and I know it's also a similarly sort of tenuous relationship with the water in Philadelphia as well, where there's a lot of management to try to control it. And maybe we need to be understanding how to live with it better. So I mentioned in 2006, I started doing research on understanding the relationship that New York City had with climate change. And one of the reports that I really got interested in was one, it was the Metro East Coast Assessment that was actually published in 2001. So it had been around for a while. And they kept referring to the 10 foot above sea level line as a space where traditionally it was something that would be flooded every 100 years, but with climate change, we'd see it flood as frequently as every 4 years. When I first did this project high water line, that was a number that was still maybe changeable. I will say that at this point, it is not. We are locked into that kind of impact. But I wanted to get out and I wanted to talk to my neighbors, not about polar bears and ice caps, things that weren't hitting close to home, but about the things that were right here in our face, things that we were going to have to live with in New York City. And thus, the Project High Water Line was born, where I spent 6 months drawing with a sports field marker a light blue chalk line around 75 miles of the New York City coastline. And the intention was to do something that was kind of weird and different enough that people would come up and talk to me. And then we could have this just like person-to-person conversation about climate change. It wasn't me as a scientist or as a media person or a politician or anything trying to convince anybody of anything other than this is the information and this is how this community is going to be impacted. I went on to partner with a wonderful woman named Heidi Quante, who came from a community organizing background, and we did the project with the community in Miami at Miami Beach, where we marked different sea level rise lines for that community and really focused on building social resilience for the time when the storm comes. For them, they can't sort of build the protection that a lot of other coastal communities can build. And we also did the project in Bristol in the UK, a community that is already seeing a lot of flooding as well. All these projects really focused on understanding how the water is already impacting our lives and how it will continue to be a larger and larger part of our lives as climate change takes hold. And then eventually, Heidi and I worked with a woman named Pam Allen and wrote a guide to the project so that other communities could undertake this project. And most recently, this past year, it was taken on by a community in Hawaii and just a month ago in Stockholm, Sweden. So there's a lot of different communities who are sort of using this method and design for the project to undertake the project and connect with their communities around their sort of vulnerabilities to water. I have done other projects since then related to local water issues. This is from a project called Seeding the City, where I was looking at the stormwater runoff that happens in New York City. And this is, again, a big problem in Philadelphia as well, where we're not capturing enough water. We have hardscaping everywhere. And things like green roofs can do a lot to ameliorate climate change, but they also are really great for capturing stormwater. So I was just introducing tiny little green roof modules to communities, having them build their own, take them home. They would get, like, this was at an event at the New Museum, and so people came and they built their little trays and they got on the train and took home their green roof and put it on their roof. And everybody, you know, the idea was that we'd get lots of people doing little things that would add up to something bigger. Another project that I did, this was done with the organization 350.org, was really looking at what are things in our community where we see the potential for change. So we worked with a number of different organizations, and then we also gave out small insert here arrows where people could look around and say, this is somewhere where I could see something interesting happening, whether it's a empty lot or a space where a bike lane could go, or a place where you could have like a, you know, community pantry or something like that, that people were just kind of identifying spaces for change in their own neighborhood. Again, really focused on like, our world is changing. How can we be a part of making that change a more positive change? In 2017, I partnered with Sarah Cameron Sunde, Nancy Novacek, Emily Blumenfield, Clorinda Macklow, Katie Pearl, to create basically a collective called Works on Water, which is a group that is focused on supporting artists who work on, in, and with the water. And we do that through a number of different methods, primarily a triennial. So this image is from the first triennial in 2017, and an artist residency that we run on Governor's Island. You'll see our banner there that says water art is the new land art. And And so we've run the residency now for 3 years. This past year was supposed to be our second triennial, but because of coronavirus, we went somewhat digital. I'm going to jump ahead to the next slide, and did a project with the Department of City Planning. We were supposed to do a durational walk of all 520 miles of shoreline. Instead, we did Instagram takeovers and had a number of different people going out to their water's edge, investigating their water's edge, trying to connect people to the waterways. So Works on Water itself is really about building different systems of support so that artists can continue to connect people to the changing shorelines in their community. And we do work beyond New York City, but a lot of our work, because we're all based in New York City, happens there. And we have had this in the past couple of years, Stolen and Carolyn Hall join the collective as well. Additionally, Works on Water hosts different kind of gatherings where we bring together artists and scientists. We're always trying to find different ways to create space for the kind of work, a lot of what we're talking about here, which is, working with artists who want to work on the water, want to work in communities, want to do interactive kinds of work that will bring people to the waterways and create that kind of connection to understand our relationship to the changing shoreline. I'm going to show you a couple more projects really quick. One of them came from the initial painting of the waterways that you can see sort of a little bit. It's not a great picture, but it's on the floor here at the first triennial, which I did with Clarenda Maklow, and then we projected the changing shoreline on the lower Manhattan from past to future. And she and I became enamored with painting the waterways. So we did it again at Wave Hill as part of a project that they did that was focused on the waterways all around New York City. And we got to paint 3 walls and ceilings and windows. And that was kind of a fun project to do, to get back to making things. And then the last 2 things I want to show you, there's a project that I am currently working on in Philadelphia called, I need to change the slide because we've changed the name of the project, Heat Response, where I'm working with 3 local communities, Fair Hill, Grays Ferry, and Southeast Philly, and 3 artists, Amber Arts, Jenna Robb, and Jose Ortiz Pagan. And we're working in those communities to address issues around urban heat island and extreme heat. That project is ongoing, but it's kind of interesting because we're working with Trust for Public Land, and so our anchor sites are these parks. And the parks, while they have things that we're looking at which are addressing heat, they also, I think every single one of them has water retention tanks that have been built underneath to help capture and slowly release water to mitigate for the flooding in Philadelphia. So that's ongoing. And then one last picture of something that I'm working on that I hope to do sometime soon, which is doing some more immersive environments of looking at our past and future through imagined scenarios where it's projected images and audio stories that allow you to kind of to embody the past, the present, and the future in relationship to how the world is changing because of climate change. So I'm going to stop there and pass over to Stacy.
Okay.
That's fantastic, Eve. Thank you so much. I still remember when you and I were having a conversation where you were wondering where you were going to go next. And you have really traveled since then. I'm thrilled to see what you've been up to because I haven't been following everything. And it's amazing about the connection full circle. You're actually doing something again in Philadelphia. I think that's terrific. Okay, Stacy, you ready?
Okay, yeah, I think so. I'm going to, I got to hit share screen, and then I've got to get my PowerPoint up in. This is when you need 2 screens to do this. Share screen, I'm gonna move this over here. I'm gonna share, and then I'm going to, let's see, did it do it?
No, not yet.
Okay, share, maybe it goes like that.
Well, you got it.
Okay, and then I'm gonna do view in slideshow. Okay, there we go. So, thank you. It's very nice to be with my fellow water and flood people on this, and great to be introduced to Jeff. because it's always wonderful to know more people who are doing this. I was so smitten when I heard that he was going to flood the floor, because I've tried to flood floors in 3 different places and they never let me. But so it's great. It's great to see it happen. I've been always wanting to like make that wet-footed experience, and you'll sort of see why. So I'm always wondering about what we think about when we think about climate crisis, because everyone has a really different feeling about it. It feels so far, it has felt so far in the future. It had been so depressed when I was in forestry school. Professors who talked about climate change were sort of ushered out of the room. And now it's a kind of common parlance, but we also still don't have very much of a grip on it. And so what do we think about when we think about it is really interesting to me. We often think about a sort of vast scale of it. And we all know that coastal cities will be flooded, but we're not always aware of the sort of intimate details of like wet feet and moldering walls and street trees dying because I've been drinking too much salt water, and pretty much nonstop mosquitoes from April to November. So there are a lot of these smaller, more visceral aspects of it that we don't think about. So this is that we do think about this kind of flooding, though I don't think anyone considered that like the holes, the cloacas of the subways would be coming back up to where the water would be coming through. I think we always have this coastal sense, but we don't realize that I have a very porous city and the water is going to come out of all sorts of places we didn't really expect. I do a lot of work with trying to conjure a sense of water, very much like what Eve and Diane do, this sense of like, you got to bring this to people's experience, because if it's abstract, it is not effective as a tool of change. And so bringing it right under the feet of people is something that's really important to me. The idea that there are all these streams that are running under our urban areas, and also these coastlines. This is the Flushing Bay. This is a painting we just did about a month ago, showing where the water will used to be and will be again. And that's such an interesting thing about a climate crisis, is that the historic creeks are filling up with a lot of rain after every rainstorm, because rain is so much more frequent and it comes with so much more intensity. And we haven't built our cities for rain to absorb rain in any way, that these creeks are coming back every time it's raining. And so historic waterways are becoming very present again. And this whole concept that we used to have a very, very firm feeling about what was wet and what was dry. And it's highly delineated. If you look at any map, it's a blue line, or the rest of it is brown. But really, we're going to be living in a new soggy period where the wetness and the dryness is not so distinctly delineated. And this idea that there's a historic path, a historic watershed underneath our grids. This is Brooklyn, and the idea that this is a watershed that is still flowing. It's been straightened out and flowing in culverts, but it is still there. And when it rains, these old historic creeks kind of rise up again like ghosts and remind us that they're still there, nature's still there, and that they're going to need to flow because we have so much more rain now. So a lot of my work is showing where that rain might be. I'm often painting on historic creeks, showing the passage of historic creeks through various urban areas, and giving a sense of that underneath, that ghost, which is going to flow again and flood again, and giving people a sort of sense of that. And this idea of like, what do we do as artists with climate crisis? And I think one of the important things is that art can really bring home a feeling of change underfoot, that we get this sense of an impending change that we can sort of feel with our bodies. And Eve's high water line did this so brilliantly that you could be on one side or the other, or that here it comes towards my stoop. I think that the abstraction of climate change has been a real enemy to people getting worried enough about it in order to do something. So this idea of bringing it to your feet and bringing it to your eyes is really key. And so I'm a lot of my work is dealing with rain in our everyday and dealing with rain as it increases. There's a lot of thought about what can art do, and in some ways there are places where art can actually create solutions. And I'm kind of interested in that. I'm not kind of, I'm very interested in that. I'm interested in the idea that art can have a quality of engineering, so it can do something that's very functional, and that we can rethink how water runs in our communities, in all our biomes. And instead of taking everything over for humans, giving much more of a space to water. And this rain yard at the Schuylkill Center for Environmental Education is one of those places where people have a small but exciting area to stand on, and the rain has a lot of land to go into, and then what the rain brings a great number of plants that can come through, can pierce the porous surface of this project. So this idea of to embrace the soggy and having artists figure out new ways to embrace that soggy and to build on it. And other kinds of solutions where this new flow, which is not so new, we've been having issues with massive amounts of flow because of not just because of the increase in rain, but also because of the decrease in infiltratable places, porous places like forests and fields are all been replaced with parking lots and lawns and golf courses, which don't soak in any rain. So this idea that all this rain is sliding off the land and flowing much too quickly into our waterways has been around for a good 3 decades now. And we're just coming to grips with it because there's so much more rain that's hitting the land. But slowing this flow is very important. And there are ways, there are very sort of forestry ways to do it, but there are also ways to bring it into the people's understanding. This is a project that was down in Charlotte, North Carolina, and it was a recently daylighted creek that you can sort of see meandering beyond these painted stakes. And these stakes were each painted, there were 4 different colors, and each one stood in for a type of shrub, a native shrub that should be living next to a stream and shading the stream and holding the bank. And it's a living planting plan so that you could, in time, take out a stake and put the plant, a small plant, in according to the color code. So it was like making a full-scale planting plants. And meanwhile, there was a sense of the bristliness that these kind of landscapes need to have in order to be healthy landscapes. But sometimes we feel that a kind of smooth lawn-like experience is what nature wants, but nature wants much more entanglement of branches and roots, and a kind of more bristly quality, and much more soggy, sometimes wet, sometimes dry. And so art can help introduce those concepts by sort of sliding them in visually interesting ways. And making changes such as we lose wetlands, how do we do a kind of biomimicry of wetlands so that they can survive through flood and drought? These are floating wetlands that are excellent because they're always at the water's surface. They have certainly more maintenance than a wetland does, but they're an interesting way to create a way of treating the water and creating habitat in this this combination of a sort of industrial material, a floating kind of fabric filled with plants that would normally be on the borders of lakes and ponds, but have been removed because we prefer things like lawn, and we want our lawns to go right into the water because of the beautiful views that are incurred. So in a certain way, the idea that of replacing this kind of landscape of wetlands with these floating wetlands is something that I'm interested in. And here, for those of you who know, this is an homage to Robert Smithson's spiral jetty. It's a reduced scale version, but instead of being this kind of macho, giant stone, solid, made with trucks kind of land art, this is a new kind of eco art, which is solving the problem in the water by taking up the nutrients, and also very flexible and creating a great deal of habitat for birds who can get away from feral cats, and turtles to rest, and fish to be in the tangle of roots underneath. So rethinking land art and turning it into a new kind of sort of art and engineered solution is something I'm very interested in doing. So thank you.
Wow. Thank you. That was really fantastic. I think the two of you really demonstrate how art, and certainly Jeff as well with the exhibition he's put together, how artists just figure out how to do things in such exciting ways that engage audiences. And that's what I've always admired about these two artists. You know, I'm more traditional, except I talk a lot and teach and, you know, meet audiences with public engagement, and, you know, try to reach art audiences when they don't realize it, and be a subversive artist, you know, like, oh, you're looking at a landscape. No, you're looking at other stuff as well. But you two, you do it in such a proactive way. And I've always admired these two artists, and I hope we have questions from some of the participants for them. Jeff, you're in charge of that.
Yes, everyone can use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to submit a question. And when you do, I will relay them on to the panelists. So far, we have none. So I wonder, Diane, if you have any more questions for...
Well, I'd love to hear a conversation between you two gals. Have you ever met before?
Oh, yes.
We've had loads of conversations.
As often as I can.
Yeah. Yeah, we do hang out. As if I'm in Philly, I'm like, I'm coming. So yeah.
Philly, you got to give me a call. I mean, the parallels are wonderful, and you know, Stacy, what came to mind when you were talking about unkempt landscapes was our recent visit to your meadow, which was incredible. And I think what you're doing and has to do with your really in life experience with nature. And maybe you could talk a little bit about how you got there, because I didn't know until recently that you were a forest ranger.
Yeah, it's not quite a forest ranger, though. I love that sound. I actually was an urban forester, which used to be considered a very weird oxymoronic thing. Like how could you, you know, Civil War, how could you be an urban forester? But there's a lot of what we referred to at the time as the metro forest, these median strips, leftover places that are too steep to build on, a lot of times places that are on the edges of streams, sometimes brownfield sites too that had been polluted and never built on again. But the idea that the nature in the city is very much the gristle. It's like the houses and the developments have chewed all the more digestible parts of the landscape, and what's left over, the unchewable parts that most people would put at the edge of their plates, are these urban forests that are these leftover remnants, and still very interesting places, very challenged by monoculture issues and deer predation. But still, sometimes that is all the nature we have. And my partner Neil grew up in Northeast Philadelphia, and he remembers as a boy having a forest at the end of his street. And he went back there as a young man and realized the forest consisted of 6 trees. And to him, growing up, that was a forest. And that always gave me this sense that you don't need the grand Tetons to have nature in your life. You need something, and we need to preserve these small areas, because that's the nature that we are going to be able to walk next to or into, and our kids are going to be able to sneak around it and climb trees in. And if that isn't preserved, then I don't get out to the Grand Tetons very often. You need that local nature. Even though they're remnants, they're still hugely valuable. So that has fed into my thinking as an artist too.
We have a first question. Stacy, is your spiral wetland a recent project? Where is it?
Oh, it's in Fayetteville. Was in Fayetteville, Arkansas. And that's in Northwest Arkansas. Arkansas is very, people are like, you're going down there. But I realize that where I live in Pennsylvania is far more, far less sophisticated than half of the Northwest Arkansas. It isn't in that particular lake right now, but it was broken up into small parcels of 8 foot to 16 foot and readopted in other people's there's some in retention basins outside of condo structures, there's some in golf courses, and some got planted along the edges, and some people took the plants and planted them in other places along streams in their houses. So it got completely adopted, but it was only up for about 1.5 years because of it was rather too much to maintain for the people who were on the lake to do the conservation group. They were having some issues.
Well, Eve, oh, is there another question? Go ahead. I'm sorry.
I'd like to ask, was there an inspiration for the end of the jetty that's not a spiral? It ends in sort of the top of a T or a J.
Oh yes, that was actually, and it's funny because that's very present in the photographs, because I'm always standing on the land, or often on the land. We had to remove it from the land. The spiral jetty is attached to land. It goes from the border shoreline out, because the trucks had to be driven out there. Our piece was actually made in the water and transported by kayak and a little motorboat. We had an Olympic kayaker who could beat the motorboat because he was so fast, and he would tow things out, and I would tow out in a rowboat. So we had a very aquatic crew, and you have to plant it when it's in the water, but it does not hold people up. It's like, it would be like walking out on what looked like a sphagnum moss, and then it would all sink. So we had to take it away from the shoreline so nobody would try and walk out there, which would be a great temptation, and I would have been the first person to sink with it.
Thank you.
My question to Eve was your Philly project. I'd love to know more about it, and I'm wondering if you're familiar with FDR Park.
I'm not familiar with FDR Park. Yeah, I mean, that project, the heat response project, is still, even though we've been working on it since March, it's still pretty kind of in its infancy stages. It's a 3-phase project that's going over 2 years. I'm working on some phases connecting the communities and doing some of the bigger kind of work, since I'm not in Philadelphia, and then the local artists are doing the work in the communities. And Jenna Robb's been working in Fairhill and working with youth in that community, and they're just they're going through a process right now of getting to know the communities and trying to understand what is their existing relationship with the extreme heat, because they're in communities that are traditionally like 10 degrees hotter than surrounding neighborhoods. So kind of understanding what is their existing relationship with the heat, what are they already experiencing, and then what is it that we as artists can bring in to kind of build capacity to do some of the work to mitigate. And the 3 different artists and communities are approaching it very differently right now. And I think that a final outcome will be really different as well in each of the 3 communities. And then I'm trying to tie it all together. It's my job. But yeah, it's interesting, Stacy, when you bring up the idea of like places that are gristle, because I think a lot of the urban waterways are that too, right? So, the Gowanus is like backwater. Newtown Creek is like back, they're so poorly taken care of. They're so depleted, and yet there's there are people who love them. They're really important to our entire urban infrastructure. We use them to dump our sewer into, when it rains too much. So that, they're used for transportation. They're why New York City became such an important city. It's because we have the Deepwater Harbor. It's about trade. And it's kind of interesting, to think about that in the same way as you're talking about like the urban green spaces, is that there's these watery spaces that are deeply important. There are people who've made real connections to them, and it's really important to continue to build those connections in the ways that we're doing it, using creativity to kind of do that. I think, in some ways artists are better at getting people engaged just because we're not coming from like any specific, we are coming from a perspective, we can't help that. But, that we don't have necessarily an out front agenda. It's something that the agenda is there, but it's behind the sort of creativity.
I want to bring up the opposite of what you are involved with, both of you. You're talking, Stacy, about rain, and Eve, you're talking about all these different channels that we have. The opposite that it also has to do with climate change is drought. And Richard and I spent a month in Chile and in the Atacama Desert, for one thing, but also in Rapa Nui, where they have a depletion of their watersheds. And the same thing is going on actually in Chile, because the mining industry is using the watersheds to mine the minerals. So, there's so many counterbalances that are being affected by climate change, where one place it's flooding, another place doesn't have enough water.
Yeah, it's true. And it's all about timing too, because it's sort of like the way a garden works. In March, you're hungry and waiting for your vegetables. In July, you can't get rid of a zucchini to save your life. So that kind of feast and famine aspect of climate change is something that happens all the time with us, and learning to hold on to things when you have a lot of them for the times that you don't have so much, because even though we're flooding all the time, we're also experiencing droughts in between the floods because we're not holding on to those precious waters. And this whole idea of not treating water as something precious is very interesting to me, because so many core aspects of all of the religions in the world hold water as purifying, or a place of where the spirit resides, or where you can find something you need. And yet we just throw our crap right into it at the same time and don't respect it. And it's what Eve was saying about the importance of our urban waterways, where these waterfronts that we cherish and need, we need the visual break with that. We need that open space. We need the changeability of them. Those are absolutely necessary places, even though they're not at all pristine. They're unpotable. Compared to an alpine lake, you would never say, oh, I really need to go out and see Flushing Bay. But the beauty that we get from those places is essential for our well-being and a kind of touchstone. And yet why we can't get our heads around that, that from raindrop all the way to the sea, that these things are essential to preserve. And there are lots of ways to preserve it. You don't have to be the Army Corps of Engineers to do that.
Well, you're speaking to Indigenous culture and the knowledge that all Indigenous communities have always had, and how that comes up against our present Western capitalistic culture, which doesn't value the planet. And there's a real clash there. And I think one of the sort of hopeful things we can cling to maybe is the fact that there is more awareness, and Indigenous cultures now they're part of the conversation in a lot of places, the Arctic Circle for one thing. And that's crucial to our survival, I think.
Yeah, I think another issue that comes up too is what artists do is artists, I think, tend to fall in love with things. And then you want the rest of the world to fall in love with you because you're so excited by a glint of water or algae and what its form really is, or that this was wet yesterday and now it's dry. And getting people to fall in love with their surroundings is kind of what I feel like my job is. And I think that all of you feel that way too, because that's the only route in that I understand of how to change people's minds, is to make them fall in love, because nobody gets it when they're scared of it. They don't make changes. They build walls. I mean, that's when they run to the Army Corps, and New York certainly is building its share of seawalls. And so like fear isn't going to do it, but this desire for it and love for it maybe will help us eke by, I hope.
Yeah, that's art. You know, I always say I still like beauty, you know, not irony, because people respond to beautiful things and we have to cling to that. And I think that's what art can do. And you know, the whole idea about being curious, artists are curious. We're science curious. We're curious people, and we make connections. And that's so important to share with the world. And you guys do that. And Jeff, you're certainly doing it with this show. I just wish it was up longer.
Well, it's great fortune that we can even keep it up this long. There's we've stretched our budget to its limit, I'm afraid. We have a next.
That tends to happen.
Yes, we have the next question for: have either of you ever been invited to actually serve on a city's permanent environmental commission to review proposals which might impact negatively on the land?
I don't think I have the expertise or knowledge for that. No.
I actually was, I am the stormwater artist in residence for the city of Lancaster. So I am trying to oversee projects as they come through that are about stormwater and how it can, that they could be expanded on and added and sort of made to be more than something that happens under the ground, but something that has a connection to people and to that people feel part of the solution too. It's an uphill battle, but it's a worthy one.
Has it led to any ideas that you can share with us now?
Well, I would have to say that after this week, one of the things that I've really learned about being an artist is you have to be like a terrier and take a bite and not let go, so that they're shaking you and trying to get you off the project. But you just hold on with your values, that what's important is that that the engineers don't hide away how the world works, that everyone can participate in how the world works and how nature works in the city or wherever it's working. And that we can all be part of it, and it can be made into something that's far more beautiful and intriguing than the world is constructed now. So, but it takes a certain tenacity.
Yes. Yes, you have to choose your battles carefully. The next question is: a healthy tree can take in 54 gallons of water per day. Maybe more trees need to be planted at the edge of water?
I would never say no to more trees, as long as they're native trees.
Right. I think it's like depends on the tree, right? We're learning that a lot with the Philadelphia project too, is like what trees can actually do the work, what can survive. You know, Stacy, your example of the project where you're showing the different types of greenery that needs to be along the bank, like it's understanding the right things at the right place at the right time. Because you don't want to plant a tree that's not going to survive in the new environment, right?
Right. And another thing is that we often think we're such a savanna people. We think of trees and grass, and really more of the world is made of shrubs and tangles. Wow. And that whole idea of the tangled world is something that we need to make much more of, because what trees really do on the sides of water is they hold the bank together and keep it from eroding. They're not actually transmitting that much water in or out of anything except for their own uses, which is fine. And one of the terrible things that happens when stream banks get eroded is that they drop down and down and down into the bank, and the trees that used to be growing right next to the water are left high and dry with their roots not able to get down to the water table. So what's really important is to not rob the streams of their more perpetual waters, and to plant the banks heavily with shrubs, which are really the habitat for birds and other critters, and get that tangle going.
Well, another thing to consider, again, talking about climate change, is that the Amazon forest is very important for rain, for one thing. I mean, the Amazon forest was responsible for watering all of South America up until, the mountains of Chile. And we're losing that. And the Amazon forest also has to do with carbon capture. So we do need trees.
Oh, absolutely. I'm not against trees, but we need that kind of, that one of the reasons that the Amazon forest works so well is that intense shade and growth on multiple levels. It's like a 5 to 10 story of different canopies inside, which is a kind of complicated biome that we hardly ever get anymore. We don't have modern versions of those. So when we lose them, we're losing. It's like, as bad as losing temples in Greece or something, that you will no longer know that architecture if you lose the architecture of a place like the Amazon.
And it impacts so many other environments, so many other ecosystems.
Yeah.
Well, looks like there are no more questions, because I don't think Jeff is raising any. I don't know what happened to Jeff.
No, there are no more questions. We're drawing towards the end of the hour. I wonder if everyone might take a moment to sum up where they're going, where their path is leading.
That's a good question. Well, all depends upon this election. I'm hoping that climate change with Biden and et al. Might really get to be front and center, because one of the things I think we've seen is, in terms of the youth movement, Sunrise Movement, et cetera, the youth of today knows what's going on, and they're aware that this is no longer an existential threat. It's a present threat. And we have to do everything we can. So I'm hoping for that in terms of the large picture. In the other smaller picture, I'm trying to just do my part. What about you guys?
I'm going to steal Stacy's "falling in love with" phrase. That's what I'm going to do.
It's all yours.
I think it's really true. I mean, I sort of just tie those two thoughts together, Diane. Like, I'm getting Democratic control, but we still have so much work to do. Biden's not nearly aggressive enough. But I also think, something, I love the work that I do with communities and, building capacity in communities and advocating for change. But I also am really interested in that last piece that I showed you, that's a work in progress, the immersive environments. I'm really interested in this concept that we can break people's hearts wide open. That's a Joanna Macy thing, to the idea that massive systems change could be beautiful, that we can actually transform the way we live so far from where we are right now, which is this extractive nature and disconnected from the environment and the ecosystem upon which we depend, that I can actually try to create works that do that lift of getting people to fall in love with the possibility, to fall in love with the idea that change is not only needed, but it's like this beautiful thing that we can collectively create. So I think that's where I'm headed.
Beautiful.
I love that, Eve, because it is change. I mean, we've been living in this status quo, and even though, thank God, the orange monster won't be there, but there will be other colored monsters. There's still Mitch McConnell, just doesn't seem to die. So we will be fighting monsters from here to eternity. In a certain way, I felt like this time has refocused me to stop thinking about these like political changes and just try and push these other changes. What Eve's talking about, this idea, that was a great quote, that people can embrace the end of the world more than they can comprehend the end of capitalism. And that really struck me. It's like, holy crap, that is like, why can't we see change? So I feel like I just need to keep running with this idea of rebalancing what nature gets and what we take, that we simply cannot take everything the way we've been taking. We can't cover the world with parking lots. We can't cover the skies with glass buildings. We just can't keep, we have been such bad sharers of the world with nature that we really have to get that sharing worked out. And I just feel like I just have to make these temporary examples of that to maybe break into people's hearts that way. And I think that's the mission.
Yeah, extraction is a good word to bring up because we have to stop doing that. We have to stop taking away and we have to start sharing and giving.
Well, thank you very much, all of you. This has been an incredible hour. And we're going to have the recording of this panel discussion on our website starting tomorrow. And the exhibition goes through Sunday. I hope many of you will get a chance to see it. So thank you all for participating, and have a good day.